There's a script written in history, a fatal six-stage countdown that has toppled some of the most powerful governments on Earth. It's a pattern that repeats with chilling precision, a story written in blood and chaos. In 1789, France was the wealthiest, most cultured nation in Europe. Within 5 years, the government was overthrown, the king was beheaded, and the country descended into a reign of terror where 40,000 people were executed for political crimes. In 1917, Russia was a vast empire ruled by a czar for 300 years. Within 8 months, the entire regime collapsed. The czar and his entire family were executed in a basement, and a civil war began that would ultimately claim 20 million lives. In 1959, Cuba was a prosperous Caribbean paradise, the playground of the Americas. Within 2 years, it was a communist dictatorship that would repress its people for the next 60 years. 3 stable nations, 3 catastrophic collapses. And in every single case, the people in power never saw it coming. They thought they were untouchable. They thought the system was too strong to fail. They were wrong. The reason you're watching this video is that right now the warning signs that preceded every one of those collapses are flashing red across the United States. We are following that same 6-stage script, step by step, and the evidence says we are on stage 4. So, what is this script? How does a nation go from stable to chaos? It's never a sudden explosion. Think of society as a gleaming skyscraper. A collapse is a slow, quiet rot that begins deep in the foundation. It's a series of cracks that represent the trust and the deals we make with each other to keep the whole structure standing. Fundamentally, every society runs on an unspoken deal, a kind of social contract. Now that sounds academic, but it's brutally simple. The easiest way to think about it is like your Netflix subscription. You pay your monthly fee. Those are your taxes, your hard work, your faith in the system. In return, you expect the service to work. You expect great shows. That's access to good jobs, affordable healthcare, a real future for your kids. You expect no buffering. That means roads that don't destroy your car, a government that can actually pass a law, a basic sense of safety and order. The government gets your loyalty and your money. You get a country that functions. A revolution is what happens when Netflix keeps taking your money. But the shows are all terrible. The app is constantly crashing. And when you call customer service, they put you on hold for 3 hours and then tell you it's your fault. At some point, you don't just cancel your subscription. You get so angry, so utterly convinced the whole company is a scam, that you want to burn it to the ground. You tear up the contract. When enough people believe the system is no longer just failing them, but is actively rigged against them, they start looking for an alternative. And as John F. Kennedy warned, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. History shows us that this societal breakdown almost always follows a predictable 6-stage pattern. Before we examine the historical evidence in detail, here is the checklist. Here are the 6 stages of collapse. Stage 1, extreme wealth inequality. This is when the gap between the ultra-rich and everyone else grows into an insulting, unbridgeable chasm. Stage 2, government corruption and incompetence. This is when the people in charge are seen by most as either crooked, stupid, or both. Stage 3, the radicalization of the middle class. This is the crucial turning point, when the educated people who should be the system's biggest supporters turn against it. Stage 4, loss of faith in institutions. This is when people stop believing in the courts, the elections, the media, the very pillars that hold the building up. Stage 5, a revolutionary movement gains mass support. This is when an extremist alternative stops being a fringe idea and starts looking like a viable option to millions. And finally, Stage 6, the government is overthrown and chaos follows, the final brutal culmination where the old order is destroyed. These are the 6 boxes we'll be looking for. Now that you know the checklist, I have a question for you. Looking at this list, in your opinion, which one is the true point of no return? Stage 1, when the first cracks appear? Or maybe Stage 4, when nobody believes the building can be saved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to see what you all think. All right, let's open the case file. Case study number 1, France, 1789. It's the 1780s, and France is the undisputed center of Western civilization. Paris is the capital of culture, fashion, and philosophy. The monarchy has stood for 800 years. It seems eternal, unshakable. But let's look at the foundation of that glittering skyscraper and run our checklist, stage by stage. We begin with stage 1. The foundation of any nation is its economic fairness, and in France, this foundation was structurally designed to fail. In 1789, the country was split into 3 groups, or estates. The clergy and the nobility made up about 1.5% of the population, yet they owned over a third of the land and, crucially, paid almost 0 taxes. The third estate, everyone else, 98.5% of the country, carried the entire financial burden of the most powerful nation in Europe. This wasn't just a gap, it was a system of organized, legalized theft. The first box was ticked. But data and percentages don't start revolutions. Humiliation does. Imagine you're a mother in Paris in 1788. A bad harvest has caused the price of bread to skyrocket, a staple that now makes up 88% of your family's budget. You and your husband work 12-hour days, but your combined wages can barely afford 1 loaf to feed your hungry children. As you walk home, empty-handed, you have to step into the mud to make way for the gilded carriage of a duchess on her way to another 15-course feast at Versailles. It's not just about being poor, it's the insult. It's the daily suffocating reminder that the people in charge don't just ignore your suffering. They are literally feasting on top of it. This crushing inequality was compounded by the arrival of stage 2. A society can sometimes tolerate unfairness if it believes its leaders are at least competent. But in France, the leadership was a vacuum. King Louis XVI wasn't a tyrant. He was worse. He was weak. He was an indecisive leader completely deaf to the reality of his country. France was bankrupt, ironically from spending a fortune to help America win its own revolution. His solution? Borrow more money and raise taxes on the poor. When he gently suggested the nobility might contribute something, they flatly refused. The people with all the power made it clear they would rather see the country burn than give up a single privilege, a classic symptom of a rotten and unresponsive leadership. The second box was ticked. With the nation in crisis, Louis was forced to call the Estates General, a kind of parliament that hadn't met in 175 years. He thought it would rubber stamp his new taxes. Instead, he lit the fuse. And this is where the story takes its crucial turn, fulfilling stage 3. The revolution wasn't sparked by the poorest peasants. It was sparked by the educated lawyers, merchants, and doctors of the Third Estate who showed up to that meeting. These were the people who should have been supporting the skyscraper. They arrived with a belief in the system, asking for a simple, fair change. A vote by head count, not by status. The king and the nobility refused. So on June 20th, 1789, those delegates did the unthinkable. They went to a nearby tennis court and swore an oath. In that one defiant act, they triggered stage 4. By declaring that they, not the king, were the true government of France, they publicly tore up the social contract. This wasn't just a protest, it was a declaration that the very institution of the monarchy was illegitimate. The faith that had held the nation together for 800 years had been destroyed. 2 more boxes ticked. What followed was the inevitable, bloody descent. With the system broken, the population turned to more extreme solutions, fulfilling stage 5. Believing that real change was finally possible, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille prison. The moderates who started the revolution quickly lost control to extremists like Robespierre and the Jacobins, who promised to purify the nation with blood and gained mass support from a population screaming for vengeance. This purification became the Reign of Terror, the arrival of stage 6. 40,000 people were executed by the guillotine, the king, the queen, the nobles, and eventually Robespierre himself, proving the old adage that the revolution eats its own children. After 10 years of war, economic collapse, and rivers of blood, the movement that began for liberty, equality, fraternity ended with a military coup and a dictator named Napoleon Bonaparte. For France, the checklist was complete. Every box ticked in blood. Same pattern, new century. Let's fast forward 128 years from the chaos of Paris to the frozen expanse of the Russian Empire, 1917. If France is a story of inequality, Russia is a story of incompetence. On the surface, the Romanov dynasty seemed as permanent as the Siberian winter. The Tsar was the absolute ruler of 180 million people. But beneath the imperial facade of gilded palaces and Fabergé eggs, the foundation was crumbling. We begin, as always, with stage 1. The Tsar and the nobility owned virtually everything. The peasants, who made up over 80% of the population, had been freed from serfdom in name only. They were still tied to the land, buried in debt to the nobles who owned it. In the cities, a new industrial working class was being born into brutal conditions. 14-hour workdays, starvation wages, and no concept of safety. The gap between a grand ball in St. Petersburg and a peasant's hut was not just a gap, it was a chasm between centuries. The first box was ticked, but it was the staggering incompetence of the leadership that truly sealed Russia's fate. This leads us directly to stage 2. Tsar Nicholas II was a disaster. Like Louis XVI, he wasn't necessarily evil, but he was fatally out of touch. He genuinely believed he was chosen by God to rule, and therefore any attempt at reform was an insult to God himself. When peaceful workers marched to his winter palace in 1905 to ask for better conditions, his guards opened fire, killing hundreds in what became known as Bloody Sunday. In that moment, he destroyed any remaining faith that the Little Father, as the Tsar was known, cared for his people. Then came World War I. It was the final fatal stress test on a foundation that was already rotten to the core. And this is where the incompetence escalated into pure absurdity. Imagine this. Russian soldiers were sent into battle against the German war machine, literally without guns. The official order for many was to charge forward and pick up the rifle from the first man who fell. They were fighting machine guns with human bodies. Their generals were incompetent aristocrats, and their supply lines were a complete catastrophe. Meanwhile, back at the palace, what were the great strategic decisions being made? The fate of the 180 million person empire was being heavily influenced by a mystical, mad, holy man named Rasputin. This bizarre figure had gained incredible power over the Tsarina because he seemed to ease her son's hemophilia. So, while millions were dying in the trenches from a lack of bullets and bread, the leadership of their country was taking advice from a charlatan. The disconnect between the rulers and the ruled wasn't just large, it was clinically insane. And with that, the second box was ticked in bold. The breaking point came in February 1917. In the capital city of Petrograd, women waiting in freezing bread lines began to protest. The protests grew. The Tsar called in the army to restore order, to fire on the crowds, and the soldiers refused. They lowered their rifles. Some even joined the protesters. This was the pivotal moment, the arrival of stage 3. The key group radicalized here wasn't the middle class, but the military itself, the very pillar of the Tsar's power. Worn down by a pointless war and unwilling to fire on their own people, they turned against the system they were sworn to protect. That single act of defiance immediately triggered stage 4. When the army won't defend you, the game is over. The institution of the military had broken, and with it, all remaining faith in the Tsar's authority evaporated overnight. The Duma, Russia's parliament, demanded the Tsar abdicate. And he did, just like that. The 300-year Romanov dynasty didn't end with a great battle, it ended with a whimper. Into this vacuum of power and chaos stepped a man with a ruthlessly simple promise, ready to ignite stage 5. A provisional government took over, but made a fatal mistake. They kept Russia in the war. The people screamed for peace and bread. The new government gave them neither. So, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks offered the people exactly what they wanted to hear: peace, land, bread. It was the most effective political slogan of all time, and it gave them the mass support they needed to seize power. In October 1917, they launched their coup, unleashing stage 6. What followed wasn't a transition, it was a new level of brutality. The Russian civil war between the Bolshevik Reds and the opposing Whites claimed 10 million lives. In 1918, the Tsar and his entire family, his wife, his 4 daughters, and his young son, were herded into a basement and brutally executed. And what of Lenin's promises? Peace meant a humiliating surrender to Germany. Land meant the government seizing all private farms, leading to catastrophic famine. And bread meant strict rationing and starvation. The revolution that promised liberation delivered a new, more efficient, and far more brutal dictatorship, paving the way for Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, who would go on to kill 20 million more. The revolution that promised peace, land, and bread delivered none of them. Russia's descent was complete. Every box ticked with a horrifying blend of incompetence and brutality. So we've seen the checklist play out in an ancient monarchy crippled by inequality, and a vast empire that rotted from incompetence. It's tempting to look at those and think, okay, that's what happens to old broken systems. It's easy to believe that this pattern doesn't apply to a country that seems modern, prosperous, and connected to the world. But history has a brutal lesson for us. The checklist doesn't care about appearances. To see that, we must turn to our third and final historical exhibit, a place that was, by all accounts, a paradise. Let's talk about Cuba, 1959. This one is different. It's a cautionary tale wrapped in a paradox. Unlike the ancient monarchy of France or the backward empire of Russia, Cuba in the 1950s was, on the surface, a modern success story. It had one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. Havana was the glittering jewel of the tropics, the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean. It was a playground of glamorous casinos, luxurious hotels, and American tourists with pockets full of cash. From a distance, this skyscraper seemed perfectly sound, but it was a paradise built on a foundation of rot. Let's begin with stage one. The wealth wasn't spread out. It was intensely concentrated in Havana and in the pockets of a small elite connected to the government. Outside the capital, in the vast sugarcane fields where most of the country's actual wealth was produced, the rural population lived in abject poverty. American corporations owned huge swaths of the most profitable land, and the profits flowed either out of the country or into the bank accounts of the well-connected. For the rural Cuban, there was no health care, no good education, and no opportunity. The gap between a Havana nightclub and a farmer's shack was a gap between two different worlds. The first box was checked. But the real story of Cuba's collapse, the core of its sickness, lies in stage two. The government of President Fulgencio Batista wasn't just incompetent. In a way, it was brutally competent at its one true goal: theft. Batista had seized power in a military coup, and he ran the country less like a nation and more like a criminal enterprise. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, to enrich Batista and his cronies. And he had a powerful business partner, the American mafia. Mobsters like Meyer Lansky ran the casinos and hotels with Batista's blessing, paying him a massive cut of the profits directly. The police could be bought. The courts were rigged. Political opponents were jailed, tortured, or simply disappeared. The Cuban government didn't exist to serve the Cuban people. It existed to serve as the local enforcer for a foreign criminal syndicate. The second box was ticked with cynical precision. This is what leads directly to stage three. The architects of the Cuban Revolution were not starving farmers. They were people like Fidel Castro. Castro was not a peasant. He was a lawyer from a relatively wealthy family with a PhD. He could have easily joined the elite and gotten rich, but he and others like him, students, doctors, intellectuals, looked at what was happening to their country and were disgusted. For them, it wasn't just about the economic injustice. It was about the profound, soul-crushing national humiliation. They saw their country being looted in broad daylight by foreign mobsters, all while their own government held the door open for them. The revolution was born not just from empty stomachs, but from the insulted intelligence and wounded pride of an educated class who saw their nation being treated like a cheap brothel. Castro's famous declaration at his trial, "History will absolve me," was the rallying cry of this betrayed middle class. The third box on our checklist was ticked. From there, the pattern accelerates, bringing us to stage four. Batista's response to dissent wasn't reform, it was brute force. And his brutality was the revolution's best recruiting tool, a gift to his enemies. Every time his secret police tortured a student protester, their classmates joined the resistance. Every time the army terrorized a village, they created a new wave of rebels. The United States, which had long supported Batista, finally saw the writing on the wall and cut off military aid. When your patron abandons you, you have no legitimacy left. The loss of faith in institutions was total. Stage four was complete. This led inevitably to stage five. Castro's guerrilla army in the mountains grew, not because every Cuban suddenly became a die-hard communist, but because he was the only alternative to a universally hated tyrant. People flocked to his cause because they hated Batista more than they knew about Castro, giving his movement the mass support it needed to become unstoppable. Finally, on New Year's Day, 1959, Batista saw the end was near. He boarded a plane with his family and an estimated $300 million and fled. The government had been overthrown. The people of Cuba celebrated in the streets. Stage 6 had begun. At first, Castro was a hero. He promised free elections, a free press, and a return to democracy. But the mask dropped with terrifying speed. The promised elections never came. The press was censored. Political opponents, including some of his former revolutionary allies, were rounded up and executed by firing squad. He seized all private property, from American sugar plantations to the small shops of local merchants. The very same middle class that had supported him, the lawyers and doctors who thought they were getting their country back, learned a terrible lesson. They had helped overthrow a corrupt tyrant, only to discover they had installed a far more ruthless and totalitarian one in his place. The people had traded a corrupt tyrant for a totalitarian one, and with that, Cuba's checklist was fulfilled, sealed in the tragic irony of a cure that proved infinitely worse than the disease. So, we've examined the evidence. 3 different countries, 3 different centuries, 3 different cultures, yet the same 6 stages, the same checklist, played out every single time. It's a powerful and disturbing pattern. But that pattern was carved in an analog world, a world of steam engines and printing presses. We live in a digital world. And that introduces 2 new powerful variables into this ancient equation. The first variable isn't a stage. It's an accelerant. It's the gasoline that gets poured on the fire. I'm talking about the internet and social media. The core mechanics of the checklist remain the same. Inequality, corruption, loss of faith. But the speed at which these stages can now unfold is something history has never seen before. In the past, outrage spread at the speed of a horse. Then, with the printing press, it spread at the speed of a delivery cart. Today, it spreads at the speed of light. Think about it. In 18th century France, it took months, even years, for news of a bread riot in Paris to reliably reach the distant provinces. It required pamphlets, letters, and town criers. Now, a single viral video of an injustice, shot on a phone, can ignite global protests in under 48 hours. Stage 3, the radicalization of the middle class, and Stage 4, the loss of faith in institutions, no longer take a generation to fester. They can happen in a single news cycle. We saw the prototype for this in 2011 with the Arab Spring. A series of revolutions across the Middle East were famously coordinated and fueled by platforms like Facebook and Twitter. Hashtags became rallying cries. Digital outrage organized real-world action, toppling decades-old regimes. The internet has created a direct, unfiltered pipeline between a grievance and mass mobilization. It bypasses traditional gatekeepers like the media and political parties. This digital accelerant means that the timeline for collapse is no longer linear. It's exponential. The fire can spread faster and burn hotter than ever before, which makes understanding the stages of the checklist more urgent than at any point in human history. This all sounds terrifyingly deterministic. It feels like we're just passengers on a historical train heading towards a cliff, and the internet just put a rocket engine on the back. But that brings us to the second, and arguably more important, new variable. It's the idea that history also shows us the emergency brake. This is the historical off-ramp. The checklist proves that collapse is a real and recurring pattern. But it is not destiny. The past doesn't just offer warnings, it also offers blueprints for survival. It shows us moments where societies stood at the very same precipice, ticked several of the same boxes, but managed to pull back from the brink. The best example is the United States itself. Twice in the 20th century, America stared into the abyss of this very checklist. The first time was during the Gilded Age of the late 1800s and early 1900s. The conditions were eerily familiar to our case studies. Stage 1. Inequality was staggering, with robber barons like Rockefeller and Carnegie controlling vast empires while their workers toiled in dangerous conditions for poverty wages. Stage 2. Corruption was rampant. Corporations literally bought politicians and wrote their own laws. The country was a powder keg of populist rage, strikes, and political violence. It had ticked the first 3 boxes and was well into the 4th. But then came the off-ramp. A leader named Theodore Roosevelt. He was an aristocrat, but he saw the cracks in the foundation. He took on the corporate monopolies in what was called trust busting. He passed reforms protecting consumers and the environment. He acted as a crucial pressure release valve, convincing enough of the population that the system, while flawed, was capable of fixing itself. He didn't solve every problem, but he did just enough to steer the country away from the cliff's edge. It happened again in the 1930s. The Great Depression was the ultimate stress test. Banks failed. Unemployment hit 25%. Millions lost everything. Desperation was everywhere. All the ingredients for a full-blown revolution were present. America was at the brink once more. And once more, an off-ramp appeared: Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. The New Deal was a massive, messy, and controversial intervention. It created Social Security, built massive infrastructure projects, and fundamentally rewrote the social contract between the government and the people. It wasn't perfect, but it was a powerful statement that the government was not going to simply stand by and watch the country burn. It was a second, crucial off-ramp that rebuilt just enough faith in the system to pull the nation through its darkest economic hour. These moments don't erase the checklist. They validate it. They show us that the forces of inequality and corruption are real and powerful. But they also prove that collapse is not inevitable. It is a choice. History shows that decisive, meaningful reform is the only antidote to revolution. The past gives us the warning signs, but it also gives us the emergency brake. We have examined the evidence from history. We have seen the checklist completed in blood and chaos, from the guillotines of Paris to the basements of Ekaterinburg to the firing squads of Havana. We've seen how the internet acts as a powerful accelerant, and we've seen that historical off-ramps are possible, but rare. And that brings us to now, to us. Let's open the final file. The case of the United States 2025. Let's run the checklist, not with speculation, but with cold, hard facts. We begin with stage 1. Today, the top 1% of Americans own more wealth than the entire bottom 90%. Think about that. 3.3 million people have more than 297 million of their fellow citizens combined. We see the symptoms everywhere. A culture of private jets and space tourism existing alongside GoFundMes for insulin and teachers, working 2 extra jobs just to pay rent. But the numbers are even starker. In 1965, the average CEO made about 20 times more than their average worker. Today, the CEO to worker pay ratio is nearly 400 to 1. This isn't a gap anymore, it's a black hole. The first box on our checklist is ticked. That toxic inequality naturally bleeds into stage 2. Public trust in Congress currently hovers around 15%. 15. That's lower than the approval rating for cockroaches. We see a government paralyzed by partisan warfare, unable to solve basic problems like crumbling infrastructure, while the national debt spirals past $36 trillion. But the real corrosion isn't just incompetence. It's the perception that the game itself is rigged. It's the millions spent by lobbyists to literally write the laws that will benefit their industries. It's the fact that it's legal for politicians to trade stocks based on information they get in classified briefings. This isn't a secret. It's done out in the open. It's not a bug in the system. It's a feature. The second box is ticked. This combination of inequality and corruption inevitably leads to the next crucial stage. Stage 3. The foundation of any stable society is a thriving middle class that believes it has a stake in the system. What happens when that belief dies? For generations, the core promise of America was simple: work hard, play by the rules, and you can build a better life for your children. But for millions of young, educated Americans today, that promise feels like a cruel joke. They are drowning in student loan debt for degrees that don't lead to high-paying jobs. They are watching home ownership become an impossible fantasy. They are the first generation in modern American history who are on track to be poorer than their parents. When the people who are supposed to be the system's biggest winners feel like they are losing a rigged game, they stop trying to win. They start wanting to flip the whole board over. This is the death of the American dream, the unspoken promise that if you work hard, your kids will have a better life. For millions of young, educated people, that promise is now a fantasy. The third box is ticked. And when that dream dies, so does the faith that holds the country together. This is the final stage we've reached, stage 4. This is the most dangerous stage of all, because it's the stage where the foundation of reality itself cracks. We're seeing a catastrophic collapse of trust in every pillar of our society. Trust in the media is at an all-time low. Trust in the Supreme Court has been shattered. Trust in law enforcement is deeply polarized. And most critically, trust in the democratic process itself is broken. Half the country believes the 2020 election was stolen. The other half believes the January 6th riot was an attempted coup. There is no middle ground. There is no shared set of facts. We no longer just disagree on policy. We disagree on reality itself. We live in two different informational universes, fed by algorithms that confirm our biases and train us to hate the other side. When that happens, the social contract isn't just broken. It's been shredded, burned, and the ashes scattered. The fourth box is ticked. 4 boxes checked. And the evidence for each one is overwhelming. If this video made you think, if it opened your eyes to a pattern you hadn't seen before, perhaps it will be useful to someone you care about. Consider sharing it, not to spread fear, but to start a necessary conversation. So, 4 boxes have been checked. The foundation is cracked, and the skyscraper is groaning under the strain. That leaves 2 empty boxes on the checklist. Stage 5 is when the frustration and anger we've talked about finally crystallize. It's the moment extremist movements, from the far left or the far right, stop being fringe and start gaining genuine mass support. It's when a significant portion of the population decides that the system is so broken, it's time to burn it down, and they've found the people promising to light the match. After that comes stage 6, chaos, the final horrifying destination. It's political violence. It's the breakdown of supply chains. It's the moment the building finally collapses into a pile of rubble and dust, leaving a void where a nation used to be. But these last 2 boxes are not yet checked. They are not a prophecy. They are a possibility. They are a warning. History has given us the map that leads to chaos. We've seen it laid out 3 times, but it has also shown us the off-ramps. It has shown us moments where reform, however difficult, pulled a nation back from the brink. The path we take from here is not set in stone. It is chosen. And so, the final question isn't the one we passively ask ourselves, can it happen here? History has already answered that. It can happen anywhere. The right question, the only question that matters now, is an active one. What will we do to stop it? To continue decoding this story together, hit the subscribe button. Our conversation has only just begun.